coffee, big cup, and hello. Welcome back to another episode of the Gilmore Way Podcast. I'm Laura.
And I'm Kate. This week, we're continuing on with talk of Lorelai and Christopher, but now we're going to dig into him more as a father. We're going to throw it all the way back to when Strip turned pink and look at Christopher's actions as a teen that just found out his girlfriend was pregnant. Is he a garbage human being, or just a traumatized kid who wasn't ready to be a dad? What role does Strobe and Francine play in failing to prepare him for this crucial role? Why did he stay away for so long? Next week, we're going to look at his relationships with Rory and Lorelai over the years, from season 1 through the revival. And then last but not least, the week after next, we're going to be talking about Sherry and Gigi. I had so much material about Chris for our fatherhood episode that I cannibalized it to spin it off into a dedicated episode about him, and then it turned into a 3-parter. Classic. And as I was reviewing the notes for this one, I was like, oh god, there's so much here about fatherless daughters too. So maybe at some point we'll do an episode on this topic more from Rory's perspective about how her dad being absent truly affected her. But for these next few episodes, we're going to focus more on Chris and his actions and the nuanced history behind them.
We hope you'll join us for each iteration. We're very excited to talk about this topic, as Chris can be very divisive within the fandom. But before we really dive into it, this is your friendly reminder that this is a spoilers all podcast. If you have not watched the show from start to finish, we don't know what you're doing with your life, but we encourage you to take care of that, put a pretty little bow on it, and come back when you've seen everything. And if you could please do those YouTube-y things for us, like this video, subscribe to our channel, share it with any friends or family who love Gigi. We are always grateful for that support. And if you have any comments on this episode, let us know in the, just drop us one below. We always love to hear your hot takes as well.
Indeed. All right, let's get into it. I always like to think about Chris through 2 different lenses. One, as if he were a real person who has a whole history and context and traumas from his own childhood. And on the other, like him as a fictional character created by the writers and used for specific purposes. And the second is where I have the most problems with him. Like, I feel like sometimes we see the writer's hand too much with Christopher specifically. And Amy even copped to this in an interview that she did, I think, for the 100th episode, where she basically admitted, like, yeah, we only bring Chris in when Lorelai's doing well and we need like some drama to be drummed up. And I'm like, oh, that's just the laziest way to have character conflict and tension and narrative movement in a story. If Lorelai can't handle her own relationships like this, we need to do some other work instead of just bringing Chris in when things are looking too rosy. And the other thing I think about Chris is that, how with social media, people have sort of noticed that everything is a highlight reel, like everything is more polished, more curated. You only want to put your best foot forward. Chris is the absolute opposite of that. We only get him at his worst, at his most like loserishness, it's just the worst of him, the most dramatic, the most horrendous. We never get moments that are just small wins. We never get anything relatable. We never see sweet moments with Sherry and Gigi. We don't see his phone calls where he gets to actually connect with Rory. We only get him showing up when his business is flagging and, his relationship is dying, when his daughter is colicky, when his wife leaves him, when Emily has manipulated him, when he's grieving and desperate. So, I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I would agree that there's definitely, I think even as the seasons went on, the writers fell into a pattern of, well, this is what we've always done with Christopher, so we just need to continue down this like negative rabbit hole for him in terms of no success. But even on top of that, you're not only just crapping on the character, but you're having the people around him also just very harshly and inappropriately judge him every time something goes wrong. So it can't even just be about Chris isn't doing well, but let's highlight the fact that everyone else around him now is going to have a comment about it, an opinion to, put forth about it. And Emily, certainly very guilty of this, Strobe and Francine, but even Lorelai, I think, is probably the most guilty of that, where she judges Chris for not having his life together. We've talked about this before, when Lorelai credits a lot of her own success, or, oh, I did it all myself. I worked my way up with things. No, you had so much help. And I think probably even more help than Christopher might have ever had. So this is why also you get a fan base that is just so, Chris is a deadbeat. You know, he has no skill sets or positive character traits. He is not a good father to Rory, because that's the picture that we've been painted and has been shown to us. So we need to be able to just open our eyes a little bit to that and have a little more empathy and compassion for him, because I don't think he is the abhorrent character that the show has made him out to be.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. When I think of like terrible dads on the show, my mind obviously goes to Jimmy as well. I mean, clearly he got his ish together eventually, seemingly. But like Chris didn't just take off in the middle of the night, leaving his pregnant girlfriend at the hospital, goes out for diapers, never comes back. Like, that is not the situation that we had with Christopher. We had a young, terrified boy who was raised with a heap of expectations and a legacy, and he's never taught the skills. He's not given the foundation that he needs to really be a father. Look at his own dad. Like, that feels like a good place to start. We've crapped on Strobe on the pod plenty of times because he's earned that. But he is a terrible father, just, we have so much compassion for Lorelai, so much grace, so much understanding of her traumatic childhood. We hear stories from her about the control and the oppression and the neglect, obviously the story that she tells at Richard's wake, where she wants to play hide and seek and she hides in a trunk and he goes off to, Europe. And that's all she can think of in a moment of recollection about her dearly departed father. It shows how deep that wound was. And we get a very similar story for Christopher in a way. Like, he's not as fleshed out in his background, but from the limited interactions we see with Strobe, he's a real piece of crap. And imagine having that for a dad. Imagine what that kind of dad would pass on to you in the way of values and skills and ambitions and discipline. It's all about, you respect me because I'm your father. It's just that very old-fashioned idea of, by virtue of me being a parent, you have to listen to me. I'm obviously smarter, wiser, more authoritative. I'm right, you're wrong. I'm big, you're small. Like the Matilda of it all, if you will, for Chris. And so I don't think he really got the chance to find a way to break out of that for himself. I think his childhood traumas like that were only just continuously reinforced over the years. You can really see it in certain moments, especially like I'm thinking of the one where he's sitting on the stairs with Lorelai while they're listening to their parents bicker about the pregnancy, and he's just like, "It sounds okay. I guess we could do it." Like, you can just see that he's so browbeaten and can't think of any other possibilities. Lorelai has, this firm resolve of like, they're not going to make this decision for us. We're going to figure this out on our own. And he's like, we're going to need their help. And, and it shows the difference between them. Lorelai just has the spirit of rebellion that Christopher doesn't. And like I said, I think we offer so much more grace to Lorelai because she's the one who made the choice to be a parent. But Chris didn't. Lorelai made that choice for him. She was the one who went through with the pregnancy. She was the one who decided to raise the kid. And she was the one who decided to run away and not involve her parents or the baby's dad in the equation. So I think his childhood deserves more of the Lorelai treatment, even though we don't get as intimate a look into his childhood. I think we can assume it's very similar to Lorelai's.
Yeah, and something like that is underlying. It's not something that just cropped up upon the strip turning pink and news of Lorelai's pregnancy being known by the four parents at that point in time. This is probably trauma that went back to Chris, maybe even just being a toddler, and how he was disciplined and how he was reprimanded. And Francine definitely does not seem like she was the type of mother that would step in if Strobe was out of line with that discipline, probably because she was maybe even scared of her own husband, or Strobe had put in that, boundary and that rule saying like, he's my son, I'm going to discipline him in the way I see fit. Do not interfere. And Francine was probably complacent in that as well. But I can see Christopher definitely growing up as a young person, even perhaps throughout elementary school, just not living up to perhaps his father's expectations, being on the receiving end of discipline that was not constructive, but was actually really harmful, whether it was verbal, physical, otherwise. And then just having to continue on into preteen and teenage years, just having almost a fear of your own father at that point for what if I don't live up to his expectations? What's going to happen when the next time I fail in his eyes and I have to be disciplined again? I'm just emotionally worn down by my own father at this point. And that is going to weigh on a young person. And so when this pregnancy eventually rolls around, I feel like he's just so complacent to what his father wants, because any other alternative is just going to be something that he'll be on the receiving end of like reprimandation for again. So it's just, well, let's just do what they say, I guess, because I don't have the mental capacity to come up with any sort of really decent plan on my own at this point in time.
That's a good point. And it makes me think to when, Emily and Richard sort of praise him, in the pilot and then in Come Home when Emily goes to him. Just, you can see that Emily and Richard have a respect for Christopher, at least a feigned one. Sometimes, Emily kind of shares her true feelings and Come Home and she's like, I never really thought much of you. I thought you were kind of weak and pathetic, but you love my daughter. You're from good breeding, and you were the one who would have stepped up here. And so they side with Christopher because he's willing to go along with the plan. He's willing to do what they deem to be acceptable in the situation, and Lorelai is not, which is why Lorelai got so much of their judgment and their flack all of these years. And Christopher stayed in their good graces, at least in that regard. And so that's why they sort of poke at that exposed nerve whenever they get the chance. They're like, you're the one who did this. You hurt us like this. Christopher was willing to go along with it. Why couldn't you? And I think maybe part of why Lorelai is maybe a little resentful of Christopher is that like he was willing to go along with it. I think maybe she was worried that that complacency would come back to haunt her because he would side with them or bend to their will instead of siding with her. And she didn't want anyone else to make decisions for her. And the only way to do that was for her to take everything onto herself and not include anyone else, to completely eliminate the risk that like she wouldn't have that freedom to be herself and to do what she wants to do.
Yeah, and it also starts with the blame that is placed on Lorelai alone for the situation. I'm sorry, did I miss something and this was like an immaculate conception of Rory? No, it took two to tango in this instance and to bring this child into the world. But Strobe is very much like, you ruined my son's life. He was bound for Princeton. He was bound to continue on the family legacy. And now this is solely your doing. So I can understand why Lorelai is ready to bolt even more having to hear that. But that's where Christopher, I think, needed to have a little bit more backbone and step in and say like, hey, this is a 50-50 thing. We were both in bed that night, I'm going to respect what Lorelai's decision is, but you can't harp on her in this way and put this all on her. Chris needed to own up to that responsibility a little bit more and confront his own parents, but he didn't. And I think, again, add it to the list of reasons why Lorelai's probably like, I just need to dip because you're not even coming to bat for me against your own father and against my own parents.
Yeah. She only saw that complacency. And, I've said it before, and I'll probably say it again, that what Emily said in It Should Have Been Lorelai when she was sort of confronting Lorelai about Christopher's new girlfriend and how he's finally getting it together with someone else and it could have been her, I always think it hurts the most because there's a negative truth in it to Lorelai. And she's like, crap. Like, is my mother right about this? She hates it when Emily is right about anything, and Emily always rubs it in her face when she is. And I get it. It's not good to feel wrong. But I agree with Emily in the sense that, like, Christopher had more potential. We saw what happened when he did eventually get it together. And I think maybe if he had been encouraged somehow to do that earlier, whether it's from Lorelai or from another partner or his parents or somebody else, to be like, we're here to support you, but you need to do X, Y, and Z to be a better man, a better father, a better whatever, right? I think that if he had the same sort of, like, if he had someone believing in him, I think it would have gone a long way for him. I think he really suffered from a lack of self-esteem from years of parental neglect and verbal abuse, emotional abuse. Not gonna like theorize about anything outside of that, but it's clear that, like, his parents do not respect him, but in a lot of ways they made him that way. I think he suffers from, a version of learned helplessness where he just has been put down so many times that it doesn't even seem worth it to him to try anymore, because anytime he's ever tried anything, things have not gone well for him. He's been criticized, he's been judged, he's been insulted. And that really takes a toll on your psyche and can lead to a very, deep sense of depression and a lack of sense of self-efficacy. Martin Seligman has done tons of research on this, and it's kind of fascinating stuff where, there's dogs in this experiment where, you can put food on one side of a sort of like a crate, and you can what's the word I'm looking for? Electrify the an invisible boundary, and they'll keep trying to run up against it until they're like, nope, can't, nope. And then even when you remove that electric boundary and leave the good thing there, the food, the dog still won't do it. They'll just sit there and be like cowering in fear. And I think that's Christopher, which is extremely sad. I think we should look at Christopher through a lens of sadness instead of anger or vitriol or judgment, because it's just like, how browbeaten of a person do you have to be like him?
Yeah, and going along with what you said about that dog experiment, I think that's definitely where Chris was, where I think he was almost at that point in time just expecting himself to fail no matter what the venture was, whether it was parenthood, whether it was getting good grades any semester, whether it was going to be establishing a career path and finding a job. I think in his mind, he probably always just had the expectation of, I'm going to fail. I will have to hear from my father. It's just this vicious cycle that I'm a part of now. So why even try and put forth an effort for anything when I know I'm just going to bomb out on it? And I don't think he even really started to recover from that mindset or eliminate it even partially until we see him show back up when Rory is a teenager. And he still is contending with it there, but I think he's started to take those steps of, I can actually be successful, and not everything that I do is going to be a crapshoot. I'm not always going to be a failure. And it's not always about trying to please my father. It's going to be about doing what's best for me and just getting him essentially, don't stop letting Strobe live rent free in your head.
That's exactly it. And I think a big part of it does come down to Sherry as well. We'll get into it more when we get to the Sherry and Gigi part 3 of this. But I think it took being with someone outside of his normal circle of people who didn't know him before and who had a mature sense of self and an internal sense of motivation to do well, to succeed, just to be this ambitious type A, I am in control of my life kind of vibe. I think that rubbed off really well on Christopher. I think he did very well in general with the structure that she provided to him. And that's why I say, there was potential in him. It just required a different kind of interaction. And unfortunately, Lorelai was not the person who was always the best capable of pulling it out in him, because she still remembers him as this cowering 16-year-old boy. And it's unfortunate, because I think, it was her prerogative not to marry him. I'm not saying that was the wrong decision for them, because, marriage is hard enough without being 17, living with your parents and having a newborn, you know? Most people in their 20s and 30s don't even do that, you know? Some people wait much longer to have children now. And so that's hard enough on its own without the marriage component. You know, most marriages struggle with the arrival of a first child. And so when you've just been married and just had a baby and you have no other experience or life skills to contextualize any of that or handle any of it, that's just like, holy moly. And so I just think that like Lorelai maybe wasn't the best person because she had so many wounds of her own that she had to work through. She had major trust issues. She had major control issues. And again, these are not unwarranted necessarily, but they caused her to block out any possibility of a different arrangement. Like it was either marriage or I'm running away. Like those are not the only two options that you have in the situation, girl. Like I got it. But she had so much fear of any of it that was clouding her judgment, I think, in those early years. And then, you know, she was the one who gave Chris the permission to go off and live his own life, that she didn't need him. She didn't want him. She didn't want him to be hampered by having a child at 17. And that was her decision, you know? It's a tough call to make for any young person who might find themselves in her situation. I'm not unsympathetic to that at all. But, you know, and I'm not saying this in such a way as to lay fault at Lorelai's feet. I want to be very careful and clear that I'm not saying any of this is Lorelai's fault. I think it's a very complex set of factors at play here. But in a way, she is responsible for part of this. Responsible in the sense that, like, she made a decision. It had an impact that maybe she didn't foresee. And, you know, it's like if you're gesticulating wildly and you accidentally hit someone. You didn't intend to hit them or hurt them, but they are still hurt. Your actions still had a negative consequence for someone else. And I think that might be what's happening here. She doesn't necessarily have to absorb the fault. She doesn't need to take the judgment. She doesn't need to take the criticism from the parents. That's not what I'm saying. But she played a role in how Chris turned out by not choosing to include him in her daughter's life and by shutting him out along with other people. You know, she made a very conscious decision to raise the child alone. And I think she realized that. To her credit, she understood what she was doing for the most part. I don't know if she fully understood the long-term impacts that it might have, especially on Rory as, you know, a young woman who doesn't have a stable father figure in her life. And, you know, that's kind of a whole separate issue. But Lorelai, like, we can't ignore Lorelai's role in this. It's one thing to say, Chris never showed up. He, you know, he was a deadbeat. He wasn't interested. Like, he didn't even try. I'm like, one, we don't know that. We don't have the early years, which is, you know, what we're here to talk about. These years that we don't know much about. We only have stories and one flashback to go off of to give us any indication of his earlier behaviors. You know, we know that he calls regularly. He's visited his family in Hartford and they've seen him at holidays and all of that. But like, we have to extrapolate and fill in a lot of the gaps. And maybe some people are projecting either their own ideas of deadbeat dads or the ideas that they've gleaned from other media about fathers on TV and, you know, what deadbeats on television look like, if that's not in their own personal experience. But I think when you strip things back to the actual words on the page and what actually happened, I think there's a lot more room for Christopher to be viewed empathetically, because he had a very hard time of it too. And then he was shut out from a relationship with his daughter. And it's very hard to form a strong bond after those early formative years where your child learns that, like, you're their father, you're someone that they can love and trust and rely on. And, you know, to try to facilitate that kind of relationship later in life, it's not impossible, but it's much harder because the bond just is so much harder to develop later in life. And so Lorelai removed seemingly a crucial chunk of time from them by not allowing him to be around, because I'm assuming like they didn't have to get married, but what if Christopher had just moved into the Gilmore mansion? You know, what if he had just been around to help out? They don't have to even be in a relationship, but just letting him be there more, letting him bond with the baby. But we don't get any indication of that. And then Christopher's allowed to go off to college because it's what's expected of him, or he's allowed to go off and travel or whatever it is he does. We don't even know. We're not given enough information to even develop a full picture of what Christopher's life was like before this. We're just given that like Lorelai's too strong. She's a super mom. Chris sucked. It was right that she shut him out of Rory's life. You know, it's painted for us in this very particular way. But when you like take a step back and think about it, you're like, wow, Lorelai actually probably removed a lot of opportunities for them to form a bond that would make Christopher care more and would make Rory more comfortable with her dad in those really early years. And it just, there's more to the story than just Lorelai's so great. She's the best mom. Christopher sucks. I feel like I had another point on that. It will probably come to me later, but like,
Yeah,
you take over.
And I feel like even going back to that earlier arrangement that you just illustrated where Chris could have moved in, you know, just been all hands on deck just for the sake of your child. I feel like Strobe would have like just outlawed it. He would have just been like, absolutely not. My son is going to finish his high school education, go on to college. I am not going to have him tied down or distracted in this way. So I feel like he would have instantly just, you know, put a clamp on that. But we have to also remember that for the first year of Rory's life, you know, she was still living in the Gilmore mansion. Again, there's so much that we don't know that we can only hypothesize about. Did Chris maybe come by sometimes after school or on weekends to see his daughter for an hour or two? We don't know. You know, maybe there was a year of partial visits, you know, where he at least made an attempt, even if he didn't tell his parents, just to come over and say like, hey, Lorelai, you know, well, how is she doing? Can I see her for 10 minutes? Do you need help with anything? Maybe he did. And I could foresee that for him because he wasn't this negligent, absent parent that I think, again, is the picture that we have painted of him for us. But then also after that year has passed and we have that moment of Lorelai just completely piecing out and falling off the grid with Rory, imagine what that conversation was like. Because first off, Emily and Richard have no idea where she is, where she has gone. There was definitely probably a phone call to like Strobe, Francine, and Christopher being like, is she with you? Did she tell you anything? Have you heard anything? What are her whereabouts? Like, were the police contacted saying like, hey, my still minor daughter has run away with my granddaughter? Can it, like, we put out flyers or something? Like, what are her whereabouts? And so Christopher is now on the receiving end of, well, even if I wanted to make an effort, I can't because I literally don't know where she is. She has just run away with my child of her own volition. What can I do here? And that was probably a slap in the face for him as well, where even when her whereabouts came back to light, and we don't know when that was, when did Emily and Richard find out that she was residing at the inn, that she had moved into Stars Hollow? How many years went by before that became known again, not only to Emily and Richard, but before it came known again to Christopher? And so now if maybe years go by, Rory's 5 or 6, and you're just now again finding out where your daughter is in the world, and you think like, well, can or should I go visit her? Christopher was probably deer in the headlights, scared you know what list to do so, because he was just thinking, you removed my daughter from my life for 5 years and never had any consideration to reach out to let me know where she was, where you were. I don't even think I should be like visiting or showing up because it's very seemingly my presence is unwanted. If you had wanted me around, this would have never happened. So now he's probably just contending with, well, Lorelai just doesn't even want me here. So why bother? Why try? Why make that effort?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just making a note of something because it will escape my brain again. There were like 3 things in there that I was like, yes. Okay. The first one being what you said about Christopher finishing school. I was like, wait a minute. Do we not remember in season 6 when he's having that bonding conversation with Logan about how many schools they've been kicked out of? Lorelai and Christopher knew each other since they were 6. Did they go to the same school that whole time? Like, they were at the same school when she got pregnant, right? We don't know what school that was. We just know that they were wearing the same uniform color scheme, right? That like red and gray. But then we have him talking about like Groton, and I think these are fictional schools, so like there's no information about whether they're all boys schools or co-ed or whatnot to determine whether Lorelai could have also gone to any of these schools. But it makes me wonder if after the pregnancy, Strobe and Francine sent him to boarding school away from Lorelai and were like, you're not going to see her anymore. What if they actively kept him away from her because they're like, you need to be removed from the situation, stay away from the scandal, focus on school. And I think that's maybe why he was acting out so much, getting kicked out of schools, not focusing on that side of his life. He just felt so much like, well, I'm not going to Princeton. I'll do whatever, you know, I can float, I can make it happen, I can travel, you know. I wonder if that decision was made for him because you're right, he was still a minor and they may have removed the opportunity from him entirely to see Rory in the first year or 2 of life by doing that. So that's something to chew on, for one. And 2, you know, going to the idea of Lorelai's open door policy and what you said there about like, I'm not wanted here. I think that really gets to the heart of the matter because there's a difference between having an open door and being like, you can see her whenever you want, but also having this sort of like contemptuous attitude that Lorelai seems to have, just bubbling under the surface. Even if she's not saying mean things to Chris, I think the actions sort of speak on her behalf with this, where it's just like, I'm going to do this by myself because you're useless and I don't need you or want you. And so how is Chris supposed to feel in those situations where it's just like, well, I have a daughter out there in the world and I want to know her, but also like seeing her means I have to see Lorelai, who rejected me and doesn't think I'm worthy of fatherhood or inclusion in this child's life. So I'm like trying to balance those feelings of rejection. You know, he's, like I said, been neglected and abused and rejected by his family his whole life for his seeming lack of living up to their expectations and their standards. And now he sees this idea of family as something they want for him, you know, like that, the sort of cultural idea of breadwinner husband, stay-at-home wife, 2.5 kids and a golden retriever, I think is something that his parents are imprinting upon him. You know, they're like, that's the life. You need to have a good job. You should have a pretty little wifey who stays home with the kids. You need to be a high-powered exec. And he wants family because that's what he's told his whole life he should have and should want. But his conception of what family is so small. And we get that conversation with Lorelai in Christopher Returns. The first time he comes to Stars Hollow, he's like, I want to be a family. And she's like, you don't even know what it means to be a family. And in a way, I think she's right. I have like 2 points on this. One, I think she's right because he grew up, I think he's an only child as well, from what we can tell. Like, he doesn't have close relationships with siblings. His parents are neglectful. Like, his family life was so narrow and predefined by the cultural expectation of their class that he hasn't experienced a loving, committed family like that, you know, the kind of thing that Lorelai would prefer to the bullshit 1950s expectations of her parents, right? So he's got this very limited view of what Strobe and Francine had, and similarly what Emily and Richard had. And, you know, if you think about it in a lot of ways, Christopher is Richard this is jumping ahead a little bit, but like when he says he doesn't know Gigi in season 5, it's because he's traveling for work. This is exactly what Richard did. And yet we look at Richard fondly and are like, Richard had his problems, but he was a great dad and he loved Lorelai. And there are so many things that we look at with rose-colored glasses because we see their interactions as an adult when Lorelai can actually like stand up for herself and interact, and forget about all of those times when she was a child that didn't really have a proper father figure in her life either. There's more than one way to be a neglectful, absent father, and in a lot of ways Richard was. And in reading through stuff about fatherless daughters, I saw a lot of Lorelai in that as well as Rory. And so it doesn't surprise me that Chris also is forced into this little shoebox of what a family is supposed to look like, and that he wants, and that's, again, jumping ahead, that's, I think, why he picks, or like why he goes against his own interests and his own like heart's desire to pick Sherry over Lorelai and Rory, because he wants, all of the things he thought he should have had before, and finally someone is willing to give him that. And so it's this like externally imposed expectation about that. But also I would like to point out that maybe Lorelai doesn't understand what family is either for similar reasons, and she's insulated herself so fully that she doesn't get it either. And, exhibit A on that is how she treats Max when he's going to be a stepfather to Rory. And he's like, what role do I play in her life? And she's like, you don't have to. She's like a Honda. She's really low maintenance. She can just take care of herself. She shuts Max out. She like shuts out other guys. And, Rory doesn't truly have a stepfather figure. And, we'll argue about Luke in that capacity in a couple of weeks, but I say that relationship was not as strong as some people in the fandom make it out to be. They're like, oh, he was the best father figure for her, and I'm like, show your work. No, he wasn't. I mean, and if he is, it's because the bar is in hell. So yeah, any thoughts on those things? I mean, I just threw a lot at you, but like, what stands out?
There's a bar. It even exists.
Right.
I mean, I think you're giving it credit being as high up in hell as it is. But Rory definitely, you could tell, like, she was raised well enough by Lorelai and given enough in terms of a roof over her head, emotional and mental stability and well-being, support. But she definitely had moments of wanting a father figure in her life, very clearly with Max, where they're just sitting in the classroom and she's like, I really wanted you to be my stepfather. That's so telling to me, because it's saying that, I can still appreciate Lorelai for the mother that she is, but there is something else here that I have not gotten from her, that essentially she's not enough sometimes, and I really could use like a father figure support system maybe. And that's what I'm seeing is potentially something that I could benefit from. And I'd like to see if I had that person in my life, whether it's Max, Luke, whomever. I think that she was recognizing that this could benefit me, and I want to be able to have that opportunity to have that additional support from, again, like a male father figure. For Lorelai to not give her that is, I think, a discredit to Lorelai. And I don't think she was doing it intentionally, because I don't think she ever realized, especially with Max, how much her own daughter was really seeking that out. But there was never enough consideration given to, again, whether, even if like, Lorelai, it's like, okay, you're bi, you're into women. And Rory is just like, I could benefit from a second parent, like, and just additional support, but I'm not getting it. She was very clearly wanting it. Lorelai didn't give it to her. And she just completely removed Chris from the equation in terms of him being that support that could have benefited her, even if, again, it's support that's kicking in when she's 10, when she's 12, when she's 14. Even when she's 16 and he's coming back into Stars Hollow and he's like, I've got my ducks in a row. Let's give this a shot. And she's just like, don't count on it, Rory. He's just going to bolt again. This is what he does. Don't put your hopes, or set any expectations on him for this. It's just not going to pan out. again, Chris being on the receiving end of that is probably just like, damn it, Lorelai, like, can you just give me just a shred of support sometimes? Just even give me the benefit of the doubt to think that like I can do this, instead of constantly being like, nah, he's just gonna fail again. It's probably even like PTSD to what Strobe did, and now your own, like, Lorelai is doing it to you too. It's like, nah, he's just gonna fail. So how is he ever going to have a healthy mindset of I can succeed when everyone is just like, no, there's nothing there?
Exactly. And I think that's where Sherry comes in, which we'll get to more later. But, you know, what you just said obviously needs a reference. The Offspring is your favorite band. What? You're into Metallica. If you're not looking at the screen, I'm actually wearing a Metallica sweatshirt, or a t-shirt rather, because I don't have an Offspring t-shirt. So today we're repping the Metallica. But yeah, that's why I picked this t-shirt for today. But yeah, like, WTF does Lorelai know about making a family, because she was so closed off from everything and everyone? And something you said triggered me as to why that is. And that's because, like you said, Lorelai wasn't enough for Rory. Like, you know, there are reams and reams of research done on parenting that validates, at least in the way, like in the West, the way our personal familial systems are set up, that the expectations that we have for what a family looks like, that having both parents in the home is beneficial to children on multiple levels and multiple fronts. Having emotionally available parents of any stripe, usually two, is the best environment for kids. It's the village of it all. And, you know, for the fact that we have 50% of parents being fathers, like 99% of the research is devoted to motherhood. You know, we have this idea of mothers as inherently superior parents because of like the special bond of pregnancy and childbirth, and like, you know, dads can't compare. But if memory serves, like, research shows that men's brains have a hormonal adaptation to parenthood in a similar way once they start parenting. Like, men adapt to be just as good at parenting as mothers over time. You know, it's not like they're, you know, uniquely removed and they will never bond with their child like that. It's just a fallacy. And, you know, Lorelai, you know, in a way, I think you're right. Lorelai was not enough for Rory. And we'll get into that more when we do our sort of like Rory's quote unquote daddy issues. I don't love that term because it's usually used by misogynists to denigrate women. But, you know, just colloquially speaking, Lorelai fostered that, I think, because it terrified her to not be enough. She wanted to be enough. She wanted to be everything. She took it all upon herself because she didn't have anyone she could really trust as a kid. And so she just lone wolfed it so hard. And her deepest fear was being, what's the word I'm looking for? Just not being enough. Motherhood, once that strip turned pink, motherhood became a new part of her identity. And I think that's another interesting side of this whole equation, is just, you know, the way that society views these roles of motherhood and fatherhood, and the external expectations that are placed upon us, and the judgments that are levied based on how other people think we're doing at those things. And so, you know, going back to Committed by Liz Gilbert, a book I've referenced a few times on this podcast, there's a quote in there from a psychologist named Carol Gilligan. Women's sense of integrity seems to be entwined with an ethic of care, so that to see themselves as women is to see themselves in a relationship of connection. And that connection for Lorelai was Rory. That was her sole relationship for probably many years, outside of, you know, work relationships and friendships that she had maybe around the town and at work. But, you know, she devoted everything to Rory. And you know, we think very differently about women and men and how they conceptualize their own roles as parents. You know, we'll again get to Sherry in a bit. Sherry is the opposite. She abandoned her child, right? And Lorelai didn't. Women who go on to be mothers tend to derive a lot of identity from that role. They commit themselves on a deep moral level to being a caretaker, and men are not taught to value that kind of commitment, especially not guys like Chris from families like his. You know, their ethic, if you will, is economic provision. Their sense of worthiness as men often comes down to their ability to provide financially. They need to provide a home and a stable living. And I think that gets to the heart of why maybe Chris went to Silicon Valley, because, you know, obviously it was the web boom and there were a lot of startups trying to make big tech breakthroughs, and people were making a lot of money out there. And I think that he went out there to make it on his own and find some success in business, because he was always taught that his value as a human and his personal integrity and worth came from his economic contribution and outward markers of success. And the value of his little family, even if they weren't married, was never emphasized to him. You know, no one understood the impacts of this entirely. But like, another reason I think maybe he stayed away as long as he did was that he didn't feel like he had the integrity. He didn't have the capacity until he could stand on his own 2 feet and call himself a success. And that kept him from feeling like that role was even possible for him. It left him feeling impotent, you know? And success in business at that time in Silicon Valley usually meant big money, you know? Sometimes even failure didn't mean complete financial destitution. But, kind of goes to the credit card issue. And, you know, even if he was maybe personally a little strapped, maybe his business was doing better than we thought. You know, we don't have the entirety of his books, just because maybe he's not getting paid out as much yet as he was anticipating, and his credit card bill is late. We seem to assume that he's a complete loser who has no money. It's a whole thing. But yeah, I think it's another manifestation of, well, general trauma and generational trauma. Generational trauma.
Yep, thank you. I deserve that one.
Yeah. And also, you know, harmful gendered expectations, right?
Karma.
Yeah, this is what I get for saying generational, because now it's totally effed my mouth. The gendered expectations of parenthood and just sort of how we view these roles differently really create sort of a double standard in how we view Lorelai versus Chris. Lorelai is praised because she did the motherly thing of committing herself totally to that. And Chris is viewed as a failure because he's not a business success. He is not emotionally available. He's remote, literally and figuratively. And I think now, looking back on all of this in, you know, the 2010s and 2020s, I think just as a society, we understand more of the relational dynamics at play in families and what's good for kids and what's not good for kids. But like, we also have to remember that this was like the 80s, when this kind of stuff was only really just starting to crop up in popular psychology books. And we were only just starting to understand these things about the human condition. And so to expect a 17-year-old to understand all of this and to unpack the years of trauma and cultural expectations that are heaped upon them about what it means to be a successful human being and a good parent, I think we're putting too much on it for it to be reasonable, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, and a lot of what you said made me think of this quote, which I don't think I'm gonna. I remember it, but I don't think I'm recalling it perfectly. But it's something to the extent of like, you know, a woman becomes a mother at the moment of conception, and a man becomes a father when he sees his child upon birth, and you know that kid is actually now physically present in the world to be viewed upon. You know, there are arguments that can be made to why that is true or not, but I think of the moment, you know, in the hospital where Chris is seeing Rory for the first time and he's just standing next to Lorelai and they're staring in, you know, at the glass case at their daughter, you know, and he's acknowledging like, you know, she's beautiful. And his immediate follow-up is, you know, well, I guess, you know, we'll get married now. He's like willing to take on that role, even if it is, you know, the role of just being the financial provider and the breadwinner and, you know, economic stability for Lorelai and Rory. Like, again, he wasn't, we've said this before, but I've just got to keep hitting it home. He wasn't this deadbeat dad who's just like, oh, no, I don't want any part of this. I'm not willing to even approach the batter's box whatsoever. I am just going to have a nice life. I don't even want to know the kid. He was willing to make that effort. It was Lorelai that just was completely dismissive of that and just didn't even give him that chance. So we've got to stop bagging on Chris, especially as a 17-year-old, like when most grown men sometimes aren't even willing to be that responsible.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like, I'm 34, and even I'm sort of like, I'm good for at least a little bit on the kids front. You know, I didn't have everything together in my 20s. Most of us get the opportunity to grow up slowly and to make mistakes and to try new things and to change our minds and to be a little irresponsible, you know, travel more, invest less, you know, just do things that are expansive for our own sense of identity. And to have a child that young sort of cuts that off for a lot of people. And Lorelai saw the writing on the wall for herself, but she's like, Christopher doesn't have to, you know, I can do this all myself, and he doesn't have to fall prey to that. And that's what she wanted for him, you know? And like I said, I don't necessarily think she holds it against him, or she doesn't necessarily realize if she's holding it against him, if and when it does sort of creep into her thoughts about you know, his lack of responsibility or his lack of readiness, which again, it's like, who are you to decide if and when he's ready? You know, you're not the ultimate arbiter here, but all right. So I don't think she begrudges him that necessarily. Although, like, it might be hard not to on some subconscious level where it's just like, he got to go dick off in his 20s while I stayed here and raised the kid. But again, she made that choice. She had other options, theoretically, in her teen years. I mean, obviously, it's sort of very briefly mentioned in the show, you know, where Strobe says, why doesn't she just get rid of it? And I mean, why not? Or why was she not on birth control? You know, there were so many ways that this could have been averted, avoided, different. And, you know, so Lorelai made her bed. She has to lie in it. I'm glad that she doesn't overtly take the stance of cutting Christopher out of petty revenge or, you know, other sort of less savory intentions, you know, because there are mothers who do that to their kids. They cut the dads off because they're mad, you know, the divorce goes sour and family court gets horrible, and they want all the control. They want the kids with them all the time. They want the kids to choose them, love them more. And it's awful to see. Like I mentioned on the podcast before that I used to be a court reporter, and I've spent many, many days in family courts. I think that was probably that, and bail courts were probably the bulk of what I did. And, you know, it's so easy to see the vitriol between exes who are trying to share time with their kids. And this makes me think of an episode of Scott's podcast when they were in season 5. I think it was the whenever Christopher called Lorelai to come help him with Gigi just after Sherry left, and Scott rails on him for not fighting for custody. And that was something I made a note of. I was like, okay, I got to talk about this. I don't think that was the right play. One, Chris having to pursue her in family court for some sort of order of shared parenting is completely antithetical to her open door policy in the first place. I don't think she was actively blocking access. I think she truly was just sort of like, hey, if you want to reach out, if you want to be a part of this, fine. I don't think she did much to actively facilitate it or be like, hey, you know, we're going to be in the hood, or why don't you come to the hood? Like, to invite him in to facilitate a specific activity or something for them to spend some time together. I don't think she was, like, I don't know if she was doing that. And two, Christopher is 17. Like, family court laws are still heavily in favor of the mother, regardless. Like, that's just the bias that the system has. It's whatever's best for the child, but usually in the court's eyes, that's the mother. And so if they had pursued this, Christopher's chances as a 17-year-old boy who, like, it didn't really have a lot going for him would have been extremely slim to get anything, pretty much. And three, it's just a horrible process. Like, nobody wants to do that. Christopher loves Lorelai, and I'm sure he loves Rory in his own way, even if it's maybe not as deep a bond as Lorelai seemed to cultivate with Rory immediately, obviously. And he doesn't want to put her through that. You don't need a court order for everything when it comes to family court. You can make independent decisions outside of that. You don't need that to be adjudicated by a judge. Like, fun facts, court is not always the answer, and is almost like never the answer with family stuff, because it's just so heart-wrenching. And so I don't blame him for not taking her to court. I don't know that the court system would have been the appropriate venue for these two to work out their problems. I think maybe a therapist's office would have been better. But yeah, a lot of people are sort of like, why did he never fight for his parental rights? Because he didn't have to. Lorelai wasn't making him fight for his parental rights, but she also wasn't, like I said, inviting him into their lives. And so it's this fine line of, yeah, he could have done more, but there were a number of sort of like very subtle psychological things going on under the surface, on top of the things about his life that we just straight up do not know.
Yeah. And again, just highlighting what you said, Rory was not being withheld from Christopher in any sort of dangerous capacity, where if Chris was having one of his, like breakfast phone calls with Rory, and he's like, hey, Lore, I'm going to be in town 4 weeks from now. Can I just stop in, and treat her to lunch? Lorelai's not going to say like, no, she'll be like, yeah, sure. Have lunch, maybe even come have it at the end. So, you don't have to pay for it. He wasn't withholding Rory from Christopher. This is not Anna and Luke and April, where Anna is very much just like, if you want her, come at me in court and come, like, just fight me, bro, and come and get it. And then Luke ended up having to do that because Anna was going that path and actually withholding his flesh and blood. And look at how much that destroyed Luke. Look at how much it probably affected April, even though, she was pretty, resilient in working through all of that as her parents were, going at it. But there was a lot of damage done there as well. And it could have all been avoided if Anna had just, taken a page out of Lorelai's book and just been like, you know what? We're grown adults here. For the sake of our kid, let's leave her out of the court system and find a solution where, if you want to, have her for like a weekend every other month, like, let's just figure something out. But she didn't do that. So again, credit to Lorelai for just letting Chris be present when he wanted to be present and when he was able to.
Yeah, and we'll get to Luke and Anna in that situation in a couple of weeks when we talk about Luke as a dad, because the difference obviously there was moving the child across state lines without the consent of the other parent, and Anna assuming that she could unilaterally make that decision as the custodial parent without a court order. So slightly different, but your point is extremely well taken, and we see how emotional that process is, and how detrimental it was to all of the relationships involved. Yeah, it's not good for anyone to have to go through that. But again, something kind of cropped back up into my mind as you were talking there about, like, we see how possessive Lorelai is over Rory. And so, like, yeah, even though she might be like, hey, come to the inn, see our shed, let Suki make you lunch. As much as she could do that, she left the onus on Chris. All of the burden was on him to decide how much and when he wanted contact. And I think eventually that wore on him, where he was just like, I'm always the one making the effort to put myself out there. And each time I am left feeling inadequate next to super mom over here. I'm left feeling left out, second rate. And that probably over time maybe reduced the frequency of the times he wanted to put himself in positions like that, which could be part of it. I mean, again, I'm not saying this is a good thing, and I don't want to give Christopher like a clean slate or a clean record, shall we say. He definitely still messed up a lot, and I'm not saying all of this is right or that his behavior is appropriate or even justified, but I'm hoping to add some nuance to the conversation around it, because most people are like, he's just a garbage human being, and I'm like, is he though? Because comparatively speaking, he is sweet and he's kind and he's funny, and he seems to have a good relationship with Rory, even if his visits are sporadic. He's never been a physical danger to Lorelai or Rory. He's a pretty good dude, and he didn't make the same kinds of egregious, unforgivable decisions that other fathers on the show made, and yet he gets the most hate of anyone. And I'm just like, is it all justified? I don't know about that. But the other side of that is Lorelai's possessiveness, which is on full display in Bracebridge dinner. I referenced the Max thing earlier, but we have it again with Chris just a few episodes later, where Chris calls and is like, I would love if Rory could spend the holidays with me and Sherry for like 2 or 3 days. We've got a guest room all set up. We're excited. We want her to come spend a holiday with us. And Lorelai doesn't even tell Rory about it until like a couple days later. And then like it gives me a clue as to what she might have been like anytime Chris asked to do something like that with Rory. Maybe he asked in the past, like, hey, what if Rory stayed here for the weekend? And Lorelai was like, nope. She didn't even tell Rory about this invite until it was basically pulled out of her. And then she wigged about how it was her time of year, as if every day of the year isn't her time of the year, because she wanted Rory all to herself. That singular mother-daughter dynamic was so central to Lorelai's psyche that like she couldn't release her grasp on it at all when it came to Chris. I don't think. Like, it was very hard for her to conceptualize any other situation. And it's so integral to the dynamic of the show, where it's like the only thing that seemed to matter to the writers was the mother-daughter relationship, and therefore the father in pretty much every instance was always left out of the equation. It's like dads are just a thing that's nice to have and not an integral part of a stable, healthy childhood. And like nobody on the show has a stable, healthy childhood. Mm-hmm. I guess Luke's dad sounds like he was a good dude, if maybe a little emotionally unavailable. But he's dead now, so we don't get to see that. Mr. Kim, out of the picture. Jimmy, now there's your deadbeat. I guess Jackson is an involved father, but like it's a real toss-up of like, hey, are dads even like something we need? And Lorelai very much leaned into that, where it's just like, Rory doesn't need a dad. She has me. That's all she needs. And Christopher very much picked up on that. You can see it in was it might have been like the end of season 2, or maybe it was from the revival. I can't remember exactly. But there's a moment when he says, Lord knows she doesn't need anyone but you. Or no, maybe it was even in Christopher Returns, but like he says, Lord knows she doesn't need anyone but you. Like that kind of feeling that like your presence is of no import to your daughter. Like his perception of their relationship is so fractured that he believes he's not necessary at all. And so I think if he stayed away, that might have been a big part of it.
Yeah. And we'll talk about it more, when we get to the Sherry and Gigi episode 2 weeks from now. But I think that's why he was just so invested in Gigi's life and making sure that he was an active and present father figure to her, especially after your mother even pulled something that was just more detrimental than what Lorelai did. Like, your mother actively chose to not want to be a part of your life anymore and to just cease all contact with you and then just completely cut herself off from your life. For someone as young as Gigi is, when Sherry does that, the ramifications that can have on that poor, sweet young child, which we see play out, I think, in a lot of, behavioral ways. And that's why Gigi acts out, I think, a lot of the time in the way that she does, because she's been stunted by, her familial unit and what she's known being broken up in that way. But I think it's why, again, we'll talk about it more, so I don't want to get too much into it now, but I think that's why Chris makes it a point to be there for Gigi in a way that he couldn't be for Rory, not only because, he had his other things going on, but because Lorelai blocked him. And so I think he just always wanted to make sure, like, I don't ever want Gigi to feel that way. Like, she doesn't have access to me as a parent. If she ever needs any sort of support, I'm always going to be here for her.
Yeah. And I think we should start winding this one down. So I'll sort of like give a couple closing thoughts and then throw it back to you. But like, again, I would just like to reiterate that Christopher had a terrible upbringing. And I think everyone could do to show him a little more grace, including Lorelai and the parents. I think that he didn't really have the support he needed to learn the skills required to be a good, available, present father. He didn't maybe have the opportunities, either because he just made the unfortunate decision to move away, or because Lorelai was sort of, not preventing it, but subtly blocking it. You said blocking, and I'm like, she did, but she didn't. So he didn't really have the opportunities that she had to develop that bond and to develop the skills. Like, parenting is very much a job that needs to be learned on the job. You're not magically ready to be a parent at some abstract juncture. The only way to learn something is by doing it. This is why we train for everything. We get education, we do on-the-job training. Everything requires that kind of instruction and support. And Christopher didn't get an ounce of that from anyone. Like, everyone basically gave him this sense of like, you suck. You never lived up to my expectations. You let me down. You're incapable. And, Rory and I don't need you. What exactly is he supposed to take from that? Like, how is he supposed to learn how to be a dad unless he's allowed to be a dad? And so, like, he didn't have the chutzpah that Lorelai does, that he maybe needed to stand up for himself a little bit more. I wish he had taken a stand and been like, I am going to be in Rory's life more. And that he did make more of an effort. But I will also say that, like, he expressed regret for that a number of times. He knew he screwed up and he tried to do better consistently, which is something we'll talk about more next week as we move through the main series. This was just sort of like obviously covering the background, but I hope we added some things to think about in terms of like where he was coming from and how he became the man and the father that he was, because, Lorelai just had so much internal strength, and she was such a survivalist, like, she was in survival mode for so long that, like, I don't know if she realized what it takes to thrive necessarily. I don't know that it was something she ever considered. And so she didn't realize that Christopher didn't have the tools he needed to do what she did. And so it's like, it's easy to be like, oh, Lorelai is the better person, because look at how successful she was. She's so great. But like, Chris didn't even have a chance to try. And so I want to give him a little bit more leeway and not put him in the camp of the worst human being on the planet, even if, his actor was maybe not the best. I don't want to get into that, but like, oh, also just sort of like a fun fact, he's Canadian. And I'm so sad to say that. He was born in Saskatchewan and grew up in Ontario and went to U of T. And then when he was injured, he had to stop playing basketball for the university, and that's when he took up acting. And also on a meta level, I think he made 2 movies and a show in 2003, which might have been why he didn't or why he couldn't have made it to the graduation episode. So just throwing it out there. We'll probably talk about that more in the next episode. But like, yeah, I guess circling back around, like, I think that's a lot more of a complex like situation in his brain where it's like we've psychoanalyzed every other character, but Christopher, we throw him in the trash bin and don't give him the same treatment because we have a different set of cultural expectations for him that are maybe messed up in the first place and not entirely fair.
Yeah. Christopher Hayden is not a perfect parent, but who is? Show me one who's perfect, and I'll wait.
I'm waiting. Nope. No, we got nothing.
And then feel free to harp on Christopher as much as, not you personally, but as much as the fandom has. And he is certainly not the worst father in the show. I mean, you've said it yourself. Jess's dad. Holy moly. Don't even get me started. But Christopher missteps. When he does, he owns up to it sometimes. You mentioned that he is regretful for some poor choices that he makes, which is also very important. And he constantly tries to do better with Rory, with Gigi, with his own personal self-esteem, to be there for himself and to be there for his children. And there's a lot to be said for that. So we just need to give the character of Christopher more compassion, more empathy, more understanding, and highlight those moments where he, does falter as a parent, but not throw him under the bus constantly. Like I think a lot of the fandom does. There needs to be a little bit more balance here. And I hope that's what in this first episode we've started to illustrate for anyone listening or watching.
Yeah. We put the entire burden of his parenting choices on him. And while he obviously has responsibility for that, I really don't think it's the only factor at play. And I think it is just maybe a little more difficult than we've given him credit for in the past. So just laying some of that foundation about his upbringing and his maybe interior world that the show just has no interest in showing us. They really view him as a tool in their tool belt for the creation of drama and suspense. And, they never wanted us to root for Christopher. It was always Luke from the beginning. It was so telegraphed, and anybody else was just an obstacle to that. So obviously we're not going to be inclined to sympathize with him, and we're going to find him icky in relation to Luke. So when you separate all of that and you actually look at what happens, I personally just see a hurt kid who had absolutely no say in what happened to his life after his girlfriend got pregnant. And then he would just faced obstacle after obstacle on his way to mature adulthood that was part of his inability to see what needed to be done and to be the bigger person and to understand what it took to be a real good dad to Rory, because he didn't have very good examples in that department.
I don't think I could have said that better myself. I think that's an excellent summarization to Chris's early formative years.
As do I. So I guess that wraps us up for this one. Join us again next week, because we're going to continue this conversation. We all know you love Christopher and want to hear more of our thoughts about this character. So next week, we're going to go through, as much as we can, bit by bit, about the series through to the revival, and kind of what happens when he shows up in the main years that we see, and figure out kind of what other dynamics might be at play in those years. So join us for that.
Yep. I'm sure if you're listening to this and you're a Christopher hater, I hate using even that term, but if you've got some thoughts or you disagree with anything that we've said, drop us a comment and let us know. We'd love to, hear about any ways that you agree, disagree. Just give us your thoughts. Other than that, while you wait for next week's episode, there are other, avenues to more, Gigi things that you could be finding out about. I don't know if there's anything specific that's going to, be going on this fall that might, allow someone who loves this show to just dive deeper. Do you want to talk about that?
No, I'm not very interested.
Okay.
Yeah, no, the amount of ideation and planning I've already done for FanFest in Connecticut, October 18th to 20th, is a little concerning. I need to live more in the present and stop living for the fall. But actually, no, I'm not going to do that. Yeah, I'm so excited to go back to New England again. We went last year when it was in Maine, and it was incredible. The fandom is warm and welcoming, and the people who run the event, Jenny and Marcus, are outstanding and kind human beings. The cast and crew that make it a habit to come regularly are similarly amazing and just so generous with their time and their stories and their thoughts. And it's truly a remarkable event. We've been to conventions of different stripes, and this is just one of the specialist things we've ever done. So we already have our tickets. We're already making plans, making moves. If you don't already have a ticket, make sure you get one, because it is an event that is not to be missed.
Yeah.
Links are below.
Yeah. Yeah. Just go click on the link below, check it out, consider buying a ticket. In all likelihood, it will be an event that sells out. So, don't sleep on it. And if you have any questions about the event, definitely shoot us an email. We're happy to answer anything about it for you that we can, but it is definitely a weekend that you don't want to miss out on.
Exactly. I guess that's it. Like, subscribe, comment if you haven't already. We appreciate all of that. It really does help us out. Anything else you got? Or
nope. We'll see you next Friday for dinner. Hope you'll join us for that.
Bye.
Take care.